Hello, students. Welcome. Today, we're going to explore a very important topic from your economics chapter. We'll be looking at the trends and disparities in poverty, not just in India, but across the world. You see, the first step in solving a problem is to understand it. We have to measure poverty so that we can track it over time and see if things are getting better. So let's begin and see what the data shows us.
So, the big question on our minds is poverty in India actually increasing or is it decreasing? It's a simple question, but the answer is a bit more detailed. To figure it out, we first need to get a clear idea of how we even measure and track poverty over many years.
All right, let's start with the big picture. We're going to look at the overall trend of poverty in India first. This will give us a general sense of how things have changed.
Now, how do we do this tracking? Well, one of the main tools economists use is something called the head count ratio, or HCR for short. It's actually a very simple concept. Just imagine a group of 100 people. If, say, 10 of those people are living below the poverty line, then the head count ratio is simply 10%. It's just the percentage of the population that is officially considered poor.
Okay, let's look at some actual data. This table here is quite interesting. It shows us a very clear trend over the years. If you look at the total poverty ratio column, back in 1993-94, it was 45%. That means almost half of our country's population was poor. That's a very large number. But look what happens by 2011-12. It dropped all the way down to 22%. This is a substantial decline. It means millions and millions of people were lifted out of poverty, which is a truly significant achievement for the country. But, and this is important, there's another part to the story. Have a look at the next column, the number of poor. You'll notice something interesting. Even though the percentage of poor people was falling, the actual number of poor people stayed around 400 million for quite some time. Now, why would that happen? Well, the main reason is that our country's population was also growing during this period. So you see, a smaller percentage of a much larger population can still be a very large number of people. This is a key point to understand the difference between a ratio and an absolute number.
Now, let's dig a little deeper. The picture becomes more complex when we realize that the story of poverty isn't the same everywhere. It's quite different in our villages compared to our cities. To get a proper understanding, we really need to look at rural and urban trends separately.
So let's think about rural poverty first. A large number of poor people live in our villages. Their poverty is often tied to agriculture. Things like not owning land or having to rely on seasonal farm work, which isn't available all year round. Urban poverty, on the other hand, looks a bit different. It often involves people who have moved to the cities looking for work. You might see them as rickshaw pullers, street vendors, or construction workers. They work in what we call the informal sector, where jobs are not secure and their income can be very irregular. So, another crucial point to remember is that poverty isn't spread evenly across India. The success in reducing poverty has actually been very different from one state to another. It's uneven. This graph illustrates that point perfectly. It shows you the head count ratio in different Indian states. And you can see right away, the bars are all at different heights. This tells us that some states have done a much better job at reducing poverty than others. Let's just take a couple of examples to make this clearer. On one end of the spectrum, you have a state like Bihar, which has one of the highest poverty ratios. But on the other end, you have a state like Kerala, which has one of the lowest. So why is there such a big difference? Well, a lot of it has to do with the different strategies these states have followed. Kerala, for instance, focused heavily on human resource development. That means investing in things like education and health. Other states, like Tamil Nadu, have been very successful with their public food distribution systems. So you see, the policies and focus of a state government can make a real difference. Okay, let's zoom in even further. We've seen that poverty differs between states, but even within a state, it doesn't affect everyone equally. There are certain groups in our society who are much more at risk. Let's find out who these vulnerable groups are. The fact is, certain social and economic groups face a much higher chance of being poor compared to others. These are the groups we refer to as vulnerable, simply because they're more at risk of falling into and staying in poverty. In this graph here shows us exactly who we're talking about. It breaks down the poverty data for different social and economic groups and compares each one to the average for all of India. Now, look closely at the data. It's very revealing. For example, among the scheduled tribes, 43 out of every 100 people are poor. That's a very high number. Similarly, if you look at rural agricultural laborers and urban casual laborers, their poverty rates are also much higher than the national average. Why do you think this is?
Well, it's often due to a combination of factors, like historical social disadvantage, lack of access to land or good jobs, and the insecure nature of their work. All these things create a very difficult situation for them to overcome poverty. And there's another layer of inequality we must talk about, and that's the inequality within a poor family itself. There's a saying that in poor families, everyone suffers, but some suffer more than others. Very often, it's the women, the elderly, and female children who have the least access to the family's resources, whether it's food, education, or healthcare. All right, for the final part of our lesson today, let's zoom out completely and look at the global poverty scenario. We've talked a lot about India, but where do we stand when we compare ourselves to the rest of the world? Now, if we want to compare poverty across different countries, we face a challenge. Each country has its own way of defining poverty. So, to make a fair comparison, international organizations like the World Bank need to use a single, uniform standard for everyone. And that uniform standard is what's known as the International Poverty Line. The World Bank sets this line to measure extreme poverty. Currently, it's defined as living on less than $2.15 per person per day. Using this single benchmark allows us to get a clearer picture of extreme poverty across the entire globe. This table gives us a snapshot of that global picture, and it tells a very powerful story. Look at China, for example. They've seen a dramatic reduction in poverty. It's an incredible success story. India, too, has made very good progress, which is wonderful. But then you look at countries in sub-Saharan Africa, like Nigeria, and you see that a very large percentage of their population still lives in extreme poverty. This shows us that while global poverty has fallen, the progress has been very uneven across different regions. Now, there's a common misconception that I want to address. Many people believe that if a country's economy is growing, then poverty will just disappear on its own. But the reality is a bit more complicated than that. Of course, economic growth is absolutely crucial, but it's not always enough by itself. Sometimes the benefits of that growth don't reach everyone, especially the most vulnerable people. So let's just quickly summarize the key takeaways from our discussion today. First, poverty in India has certainly declined over the last few decades. That's the good news. However, this reduction has been very uneven, both across different states and among different social groups. We saw that some groups, like the scheduled tribes and casual laborers, are much more vulnerable. Globally, poverty has also reduced, but again, the progress is not the same everywhere. All of this tells us that reducing poverty is a complex challenge. It requires a combination of economic growth, well-designed government policies, and a real focus on social inclusion to make sure no one is left behind. And I'd like to end with a question for you to think about. Knowing that poverty affects different regions and different groups of people so differently, what do you think is the best way forward? What kind of solutions do we need to reduce poverty for everyone? Keep that question in mind. Thank you for your attention today.